This afternoon, I'm in Eugene, Oregon, having driven down here this morning and from Olympia, Washington. The weather, although it's January, is delightful. Quite unlike the stereotypical rainy weather that we get in this part of the country frequently in the winter. It was beautiful today, although there was a touch of fog here and there along the way. And I'm here at the Law School Library at the University of Oregon, talking with Ann Hyatt, who is Professor of Law and Director of the John E. Jaqua Law Library here at the university. Ann, it's sort of custom in these conversations to start by asking a little bit about yourself. Could you tell us about your life, perhaps not only today, but also when you were young?
Okay. I grew up in South Carolina. Mm-hmm. My mom and dad, my mother was an elementary school teacher, and my dad's a chemical engineer. And there were 5 kids in my family. We were always taught by my parents that education was an extremely important value. Mm-hmm. I think like a lot of librarians, it was looked on as a value that we would be educated and would help other people. And so I grew up and I went in Aiken, South Carolina. I went to college at Southwestern at Memphis. Mm-hmm. It's now known as Rhodes College. It was Southwestern then. Mm-hmm. So Rhodes College for liberal arts education. I majored in English and met my husband, but I didn't marry him until 30 years later.
30 years later, you wanted to wait.
Well, maybe 20.
Yeah.
But anyway, I didn't know what I was going to do after college, but my mother reminded me that I needed to get a job as soon as I graduated and suggested that I get a teaching degree. Mm-hmm.
Parents are often that way. I think you should move on and get off their payroll.
Right, right. And kids are not really expecting that sometimes.
You're probably quite right.
So I went to the dean of the college and told him that I needed to become a teacher, and he said that I was at the wrong college because they didn't have a teaching program at Rhodes. So I went back and told one of my friends that worked in the library about my plight, and she said, "Why don't you go to library school with me? I'm going next year to Emory." And I said, "Okay." And so I went to library school. And after I graduated from Emory in 1980, I worked as an academic librarian and a public librarian. I worked at Southwest Texas State University as a database librarian. That was when Dialogue was first starting. And
that was the early years of databases.
And then after 3 years, I moved over to the Austin Public Library and worked as the database librarian for the public library in downtown Austin for 3 years. And after that, I went to Austin Community College and worked as a reference and serials librarian. So it was hard for me to hold on to a job for more than 3 years because I would get bored and then I would want to do something different. And I went along like that until I decided that I needed to go to law school because I wanted to be an attorney. Mm-hmm. It was in the era of LA law, and I really liked the clothes that they wore.
Didn't look boring on TV.
So I decided at the time I was living in Austin, Texas, and I decided I wanted to live on the West Coast. So I moved to Seattle to go to law school at the UW. I didn't realize it wasn't on the coast, but it was close enough, and it was in a beautiful part of the country. So I toddled along to Seattle and lived there for 3 years while I went to law school, and found law school a marathon and a wonderful, unmatchable intellectual challenge. It was very exciting.
Well, you moved around a bit. I mean, you start in the southeast part of the country, and then you go to the far northwest to the University of Washington in Seattle.
My mother kept asking me why I wanted to move all the way across the country from her. It wasn't that. I love my family. I felt a kinship with the geography of the Pacific Northwest. I love the trees and the greenery and the rain and the sense of adventure.
Now remember, I just told everybody the introduction is not raining today, so we have to be careful what we say.
I like sunshine too.
Yeah.
So I did plan to practice law. I went to the King County prosecutor on the civil side because King County is self-insured, and so they do both civil and criminal work.
King County being where Seattle is in
Yes.
that county. Yeah.
Yes.
Mhm.
And I did an internship for the summer, my second year of law school.
Mhm.
And I could not get back to the library fast enough. It was a completely different ballpark for me working in the firm of the prosecutor on the civil side. I worked with the torts people, and I loved torts in class. In theory, it was very interesting. But in real life, it turned out that there were people who were hurt and people who may have been held responsible. But it was a difficult working environment for someone who is not good with conflict. I don't know why I didn't realize that when I went to law school. But one of the other things was that I had been a librarian for 10 years and was used to working in a very collaborative environment where the common goal is to help the student or the member of the public who needs help. So it wasn't in line with my previous work ethos. And I was lucky because I was at University of Washington, and all of the librarians at Gallagher were my friends. I had spent a lot of time with them. I was impressed by their level of competence and their professionalism, which is much more focused than what I had experienced in a more general academic library. So I burst into Penny's office one day and said, "Can I be a law librarian?" And she said, "You betcha."
That should be Penny Hazelton, the
Yes.
director there, or
Yes.
associate dean for a library and whatever.
Yes, and the administrator of the Gallagher education program, the special law librarianship program for attorneys, in which they become librarians in the course of a year. And
But you'd already done that the other way around.
Yes, exactly. So I had a lot of fun that third year of law school because I took all of Penny's courses, and we reached agreement that I was in the place where I should be. And then I graduated from law school.
Mm-hmm.
And then I went to Lane Powell, Spears Lebersky, a law firm in downtown.
Downtown Seattle.
Yeah,
yes.
downtown Seattle. One of those very tall buildings. And it was very exciting because I was actually getting to do the legal work, the legal research for the attorneys who were building their cases. So it was all of the intellectual challenge and none of the arguing at court.
So the part of practicing law that you liked, you were doing.
Yes.
And the part that
Yes.
you didn't really prefer, somebody else was
Yes.
taking care of.
Yes.
Pretty good deal.
I had already been a reference librarian for 10 years.
Uh-huh.
So when I went to the firm, it was very different because it was expertise, deep expertise in a particular subject matter was very important, in fact, essential to success in doing that legal research for the attorneys at the firm. And of course, not all attorneys needed you to delve that deep into the case. A lot of it was more less complex, but still you needed expertise in the finding
I suppose
skills.
there's sort of a cost-benefit equation. A client can only be charged for so much, and you have
That's
to be
true.
realistic.
That's true. But on the other side, what was really fun about it was that money was not really an object if you needed a piece of information that could only be found in one of the more expensive specialized online resources. So the Dow Jones resources, or, because it was all separate then still. So it was a lot of fun to learn all the different and have access to all the different resources that an academic law library would not necessarily be able to afford. So that was fun, and I worked with really smart people who helped me get up to speed and were really a lot of fun to work with in that shop. So I was grateful to my colleagues there for bringing along a whippersnapper and not minding all of the crazy questions.
Plus you had your resource people out at the university, I'll bet, if you needed a question that they could help you with.
That's true. It's a very collaborative community.
Yeah.
In the Pacific Northwest, we had LOPS, the Law Librarians of Puget Sound, and that was a very nice collaboration between academic and firm librarians that, of course, still is going strong. And Westpac, the larger regional group, was also a really good resource. But everyone that I worked with was so smart and so dedicated to getting the right information to the right client. It was very fun.
Now, at that time, you had the King County Law Library.
Yes.
Actually, near where you first worked, I
Yes.
guess. You were probably downtown, you said.
Yes.
Because I know they also have out in Kent, which is a suburb.
Yes, the Justice Center.
Justice Center.
Yes.
Where the prosecutor has offices as
Right.
well.
Right.
Was Seattle, was that library, law library up and running yet, or was it still part of the University of Puget Sound in Tacoma?
At the time when I worked at Gallagher, well, at the time I went to law school, the UPS held that law school, so it was in Tacoma.
Okay.
Yeah, and then they moved up later in the 90s. I
Yeah,
think.
because now there are two academic law libraries,
Right.
big ones in
Right.
Seattle.
Right, but at the time it was really important for all of the firm librarians to be able to run back and forth to King County Law Library, where Gene Holcomb was the director,
Yes.
and also to Seattle Public Library, because there were a lot of business resources there that we would need to get hold of. And not as much was online. The internet wasn't really there yet. We had access to bulletin boards, chat rooms, and gopher access to internet at that point. This was between 1993 and 1996, and it didn't really fully come on until later in the 90s.
You know, it's interesting today, I mean, this is 2015.
Right.
We take for granted having not only access to all this data
Right.
available, but very quick access.
Right. It's miraculous. It really is. And I think, well, people will look back at the era of the 80s, 90s, and realize that the internet was as huge a social innovation as anything that Freud or Karl Marx or Albert Einstein came up with. It's made an enormous difference in the lives of the people. So for librarians too, it's been great, because I can remember at Austin Public Library when a patron would come in and need lyrics to a song. There was such a thing as the Wilson Song Index, patterned on all of the other print Wilson indexes, just like Reader's Guide to Periodical Literature, which I've taught 1,000,000 times to students who had to do their research paper. But if you had to go through the Wilson Song Index volume by volume, and 90% of the time the song would not be in there at all.
Oh.
So it was quite a different thing than, oh, I want the lyrics to this Foo Fighters song, and all I have to do is put a few words in, and there it is. It's wonderful.
Yeah.
It's really life-changing. And I like it as much as anybody. I think it's wonderful.
Well, you've been part of the transition too.
Yeah.
You started off with dialogue and some of those
Right.
old databases, and
Right.
now, of course, we have all sorts of them. I mean,
Right.
I'd say Westlaw and Lexis, but it's gone well beyond
Right.
that in today's world,
Right.
in our field.
Right. Well, it's been so interesting because in our field, the librarian was the gatekeeper. When I first started, and for my first several jobs, I would run bibliographies, basically, for people who might be a graduate student in physical education, for instance, and having to do a dissertation on the kinetics of the baseball bat, or at least a master's thesis. And so you would have to go into a very specialized sport database to find these articles, and then you would print out the bibliography, and then you would have to go to the full text sources. And at that point, in my first job at Southwest Texas State University, it was 1982, from 82 to 85, we introduced OCLC for patron use.
Oh,
But
that was quite a transition too.
It was groundbreaking. I remember
Yeah.
thinking how advanced we were, because you could show a patron how to do a search for a periodical title with the key of 333, the first three letters of each of the first three words of the serial title.
Some of our colleagues were nervous that databases like OCLC, actually OCLC specifically, would render
Right.
a lot of us obsolete in
Right.
our field.
And although it has become simpler for our users to find the information themselves, it means more than ever that librarians need to teach people how to assess the value and usefulness of their information. So it's much more fun, I think, to be a teacher than a guardian. And the idea that a student in high school now can do a more sophisticated search in better resources than I was able to do as a professional librarian for years is just very exciting to me. I think it's just great. And I think it is a clear pointer for us that our role has to be instructional.
Well, you have moved along in the profession. You started off as a law librarian, I suppose, totally credentialed with the firm in Seattle. Could you talk about your progression? Now you're here at the University of Oregon. Can you talk about in between and
Right.
that kind of thing?
Well, Penny Hazelton is still my boss. And she's always been my boss. I don't know if she knows that or not, but
Knowing Penny, she might. You probably know she's all of our bosses, sort of.
so I had Penny's advice when I took the job at Lane Powell. It was a great opportunity, and I loved doing it. But when an opening came up at University of Washington in the Access Services Department, I was right there because my heart is in education. So I wanted to be in an educational institution. And working for Penny is just great because you know that she's going to let you go with the crazy idea or, the impulse. As long as you can back it up, she's right behind you. She's energized by new ideas. And she's done a lot for the profession and a lot for our users. So I was excited to have a chance to work with Penny and the whole crew at Gallagher, a team of consummate professionals.
Now, when you were in law school at the University of Washington, did you ever work in the law library as some sort of student assistant or whatever?
No, I was so focused on the academic side of law school. I was determined to do well in law school to
So
prove
now,
to
now
myself.
you've come back full circle into the city.
Yes.
You've gone with the firm, and now you're back actually
Yes.
as the prosecutor with the law firm, and now
Right.
you're back at the University of Washington.
Right. It was great.
Mm-hmm.
I learned how to build a team of people. Our access services team works very well together, and we were able to introduce innovation. It was a really important time. When I first came on board, Penny told me that access services was the place to be because it was absolutely necessary that we begin to function more like a multi-institutional library. And so that was about the time when the Washington libraries went to the Summit consortium model and later joined up with the Oregon libraries to become the Orbis Cascade Summit Consortium of Oregon, Washington, and some other libraries, where we have accelerated access to materials shared by all of the libraries, and user-initiated and mediated interlibrary loan. So it made it so that all of the libraries in Oregon and Washington that were part of this consortium basically shared a great big collection. And we still do that. In fact, we've recently moved to a shared ILS among all of the Orbis Cascade libraries. It's interesting right now. It's the beginning of a huge change in the way we think about materials and libraries. So, of course, we're having some bumps in the road to get going with it. It's absolutely going in the right direction now. I think ultimately we need to have that kind of access and sharing and facilitated collections throughout the United States on a national scale as well as regionally. And we're getting there. So that's kind of fun to be involved with. At the time, we were just coming along with technologies like Arial, Rapid, Iliad, that make it so that a patron can click the button and receive an electronic copy of the material that she wants in her mailbox.
Oh.
So it's very cool. I love that. And I learned that I enjoyed working with teams, because I didn't know that before. I had always, as a reference librarian, worked collaboratively, but not as the supervisor or the cheerleader or the coach or any of those other roles that directors have, and mid-level managers as well. It's a lot of communication. And for an introvert, that can be difficult.
Well, you were certainly at the right place, it sounds like, at that point in your career.
I
You had those
enjoyed
experiences.
Yeah.
Began to get involved in, I suppose, what today's law librarians would consider the norm, the modern part
Right.
of our profession. You know,
Right.
how we operate today. Yeah.
Right. Yes, that's true.
Yeah.
And I was able to get the managerial experience that every librarian needs to take a bigger part in the decision making for the organization.
Now, I remember at the University of Washington, the library didn't get involved in my day in the teaching of the law students much. Had that changed at all? Did you have any
Yes.
teaching role at the University of Washington?
When I was a student at the University of Washington from 1990 to 93,
Uh-huh.
the law librarians taught legal research in the basic legal skills classes.
Okay.
And also would do skills, research skills in particular classes, would teach research skills, for example, in the environmental law class. So those librarians, for as long as I've known them, at least since 1990, have been very involved in the teaching program. And of course, Penny was teaching advanced legal bibliography, and all of the librarians had a mentoring and teaching function through the law librarianship program. So they were teaching law students, but they were also teaching future librarians.
And all that existed in my day there.
Yes.
I was there a tad earlier than you were, actually, back in the 50s and 60s. But even the head librarian, Marion Gallagher, didn't teach in those days in the law school. She taught in her own program, the law
Right.
librarianship program, extensively.
Right,
And
right.
you know, none of the other librarians taught. They had a group of legal research and writing people
Right,
who taught all of that
yes,
in
Yeah.
the first years. And it didn't have the advanced course in those days in
Right.
research.
right.
So change had occurred. And it
Yes.
sounds like it's very much like I hear in other law schools today. There's a lot of teaching for librarians. of law
That's true.
librarians.
That's true. As I've done some of the ABA site visits at different schools, one of the things that really strikes me is the amount of teaching that people are doing. And many law librarians are teaching credit courses as well as just the specialized research skills that we are so immersed in. So
Yeah. So you were at Washington for how long?
For 6 years,
6
the
years?
longest I'd ever had a job.
Oh, you didn't get bored after 3, huh?
No.
Like in the old days.
No, there was always something new to learn. Yes.
And
Well, I've moved around a lot. And
Uh-huh.
so I was there at Gallagher for 6 years. And during that time, I got married and had a child.
I
And
mean, the 30-year courtship finally was up.
exactly, I married my friend from college
Uh,
in 1999, I guess. So that would be, 30 years.
yeah.
Anyway, 25. Stuart and I.
Nobody's counting.
Stuart and I had a little boy named Charlie, who's wonderful. He's
Uh-huh.
15 now. And
They do grow up, don't
they
they?
do.
Yes.
They do. And between family obligations back in South Carolina and my readiness to take on larger responsibility for the law library, we decided to move back to Florida to for me to be the director at Florida Coastal School of Law,
Okay.
which is a for-profit law school in Jacksonville, Florida,
Mhm.
and an incredibly interesting educational experiment. So we drove from Seattle to Jacksonville with a 2-year-old and moved in, and that law library was so much fun. It was very interesting because it was a new law school. The law school had only existed for 6 or 7 years. And so we were just getting provisional approval, and I can't remember.
You worked with Dennis Stone in those days?
I did. I
Was
worked
he-
with Dennis
He
Stone.
was there at the time.
But he wasn't in the library.
No, he was the founding dean or
He
something,
was
or
one of-
president or whatever
Yes, one of the
title was.
founders,
Yes.
yes. And he was teaching torts,
Yeah.
and I was excited to see him, and he gave me a lot of good information about
Mhm.
teaching and how important it is for the law library director to be a full member of the faculty and to teach at the same level that the rest of
Well,
the
Dennis
faculty
had
do.
come up through the library,
Yes.
among other things, to the University of Connecticut.
Yes.
He was there before he got involved in the founding of the
Right.
Florida Coastal, and I guess there's another school or two
Yes,
in their
yes.
orbit as well.
Yes, the board of directors, the owners have sister law schools as well. And it's really neat. It was a very fun place to be. Dennis had a lot of big ideas and still
Mhm.
does, I'm sure. Because the school was fairly new, there wasn't an entrenched history or culture among the faculty or the administration.
Mhm.
And there was an idealism about the school that is kind of rare, I think, in a lot of law schools. We all wanted to give our students the practice skills they would need to go out and serve an underserved community. Because towards the beginning, Florida Coastal was more locally focused than it became as recruiting students on a national level. The faculty were mostly practitioners,
Mhm.
and with some other academic people brought in as well. And were inventive teachers and very open in terms of being a community and helping each other teach and helping their students succeed. So we focused a lot on practice skills, and the faculty accepted me as an equal, and I began to teach administrative law, which was a favorite topic of mine. It was great. It was really, really fun. And then after a year, the dean left, and we had an interim dean. And Dennis was part of the newer administration, as he had been part of the older administration, and asked me to take on the role of academic dean. So at Florida Coastal, that meant organize the faculty.
In other words,
basically.
you had to herd all the cats.
But, librarians are great organizers,
Yeah.
and a lot of times, all faculty need is, an assigned room and some benchmarks, and we all figured it out for at least a year until there was a more permanent administration hired. It was very fun.
Mm-hmm.
I very much enjoyed it, and it taught me a lot about, especially working as the academic dean, taught me a lot about what the picture looks like from that end of the law school rather than from the library, which is a particular perspective, very important perspective.
It's always, I think, helpful to kind of understand that there is a broader picture.
Yes.
And
Yes.
it's useful to have some semblance of what drives the other parts of the equation, shall we say.
That's right.
Yeah.
Because ultimately, and I know not everybody agrees with this, for me, the purpose of the law library is to support the educational program.
Yeah.
So whatever the library
I don't know
does,
who would dare not agree with you or would say so even. But,
well, whatever the law library does and whatever organization it finds itself,
yeah.
I don't, the thing that we have to keep our eye on is how best to support the legal education program. And there are a lot of choices, but those choices have to be focused with that, through that lens, I believe. And it really helps everybody on the team to know this is what we're here for. It needs to support the law students and the law faculty, or we're not going to do it, because there is not enough attention or energy or money to do everything that we could do. There's a lot of neat things to do.
Now, the Florida coastal model, for lack of a better word, is not
Yes.
unique to just that or the group of law schools, the sister schools, as
Right.
you described them. There are others around the country.
Right.
And, those of us in the more traditional academic arena,
Yes.
as you are today here at
Yes.
the University of Oregon,
Yes.
Presumably were when you worked at the University of Washington,
Yes.
too. There's a bureaucracy with which you have to work.
Always. Yes.
But I've heard one of your successors at Florida Coastal describe the fact that one of the more refreshing aspects of working in that environment was you don't have quite that.
Right.
Decision-making can move along much more rapidly.
It was a more nimble organization.
Yes.
Yes. Although, part of that is because it's private rather than public. And part of it is because it's standalone rather than part of a university. I mean, there are many factors that lead to that.
Yeah.
So for the librarian, that means, okay, here I am, I'm in a for-profit law school. What does that mean? It means I have owners instead of a board of regents. But the ABA standards still apply across the board.
Oh, yeah.
So,
You want approval, you have to measure up
right,
in all those respects.
that's right. So thank goodness for that,
Mhm.
right? I mean, that's a good standard to have.
Well, it sets good benchmarks for
Right.
what you're trying to achieve and presumably how long it's going to take.
Right.
And that's useful in terms of the librarian putting together the plan and
Right.
the administration on the other end
Exactly.
evaluating it and understanding how it fits.
That's exactly right. So we have to take care to make sure that those standards continue to reflect the importance of the library in the educational enterprise, but also what its role should be in that enterprise. At any rate, so if you're in a standalone law school, you have to think about resources that are not going to be available because of the affiliation with the university,
Yeah.
particularly a research university. And if you're private, you might be able to target your program more closely depending on what the mission of the law school is. So all of these things go into the hopper when you're thinking about the collections that you're going to put together and the teaching services that you're going to offer, as well as the staffing positions that you need and how those folks should be arranged. I think one of the most interesting things that I learned as an academic dean was that the library was really significant to me in its absence from the problem-solving table. I highly valued the law library for doing a great job without messing up all the time. Because as anybody who's done law school administration knows, there are a series of crises that come about time after time after time. There's always going to be a problem with the teaching of a particular individual, or a problem with how many different problems are there with students that come up during the course of matriculation. So it can be one crisis after another. Of course, if you've got plans and it's not a particularly tempestuous time, it will run smoothly. But the one problem that you usually don't have is the library. And a dean really appreciates that because they don't have to pay attention.
Probably why so many deans and librarians are, get to know each other in a collegial fashion where they can at least get another opinion that isn't quite.
I hope that's still true.
Yeah.
I think with one of the changes in legal education over the time that I've been involved in it is the increase in administrators. And it's necessary because we've had to professionalize administration. Our students these days expect a level of service and the amenities and attention paid to a lot more things.
I've read that criticism of higher ed too. That there's
Right.
too much administration and
Right.
not all that's going into teaching.
Right, I understand that from a faculty member's point of view that seems like a problem.
Yeah.
From an administrator's point of view, I think it's a boon to the faculty because they don't have to do those things like scheduling and paying the bills and creating the software needed to take exams on computers. And on and on and on. There's so much more involved than there used to be.
And you're right about the students needing services. And some of those services didn't exist in my law school when I was in law school. I mean, we didn't have placement operation.
Right.
It's a big part of a law school
Right.
today. Admissions was a lot easier in those days. We didn't have to have, we didn't have as many files coming through, but it was a simpler process.
Right.
I mean, they looked at the grades and the LSAT and made a quick decision on somebody, for the most part.
The landscape has changed drastically.
Oh, very much.
And it's in flux still, of course. But it's not just I don't think, just the crisis of high tuition and fewer jobs. It's been coming for a long time, and we changed the way that we teach, and students have changed the way that they learn.
And even the number of faculty, I mean, in the old days, it was much smaller group, much more focused curriculum.
Right.
As an academic dean, I mean, as I alluded to, you're herding cats, so you had a lot of cats on the faculty and lots of course offerings, and everything has to be sort of sorted out.
Right. But even since then, because I came back from, I only stayed for 2 years at Florida Coastal when the opportunity arose to come back to the Pacific Northwest, which is where my family and I wanted to be. So, of course, we jumped on that. But even at that point, and that was in 2002. Since 2002 till now, many more programs and centers have sprung up in all of the law schools, many more specialized faculty, and the addition of many more clinicians, which is necessary for the students to get their practice skills.
Well, during an earlier part of today, you and I were chatting off camera, and I normally don't bring off camera stuff in, but this is sort of germane. You said that this building that we're in today is about 15 years old.
Yes.
And one of the problems you all have to confront is
Yes.
there isn't enough space for all the
Right.
programs.
Right.
And that's not
Yes.
unique to the University of Oregon Law School.
That's right. And then I mentioned that, like many other new building projects from the 90s and the early 2000s, it was a phased project, and the
It was
second
a
and third
nice parking lot nearby, they were gonna build onto that, huh?
but then that never happened.
At least not yet.
Right. So, for instance, we have roughly an average of 500 students at any one time, and that's in the JD, Masters, and LLM programs, which are also new, by the way. And we've also started an undergraduate legal studies program. So law schools have to be flexible and find their students in a bigger variety of disciplines and cohorts. So more students, more different students, but we can't really admit more because we don't have enough classrooms to do that. So it's an interesting mix of more faculty, more specialized programs, and about the same number of students. It is hard to make ends meet in this environment. And of course, with the budget difficulties of lower enrollments and more specialized programs, the library does take a hit. And that's...
Now, you are here at the University of Oregon. You are actually part of the library system.
Yes.
You have a dean of libraries
Yes.
who oversees all the libraries, including the law library.
That's correct.
Now, in this day and age, earlier you were talking about some of the consortia sorts of things that are
Right.
going on in this region of the country,
Right.
among the various schools.
Yes, yes.
I imagine being part of the library system helps foster some of your involvement in some of that, I would
It
think.
does. It does. We have, oh my gosh, now this is going to sound like bragging. Oh dear.
Well, that's all right. It's your conversation. You can brag all you want.
Well, it's
The
not.
only thing I cut out is if somebody says something really bad about some guy named Pat Keel. That might not make it, but everything else I usually did.
Well, I'm thinking about the economies of scale
Yeah.
that you reach when you are a smaller part of a larger system. And it's not, this of course is not limited to the situation of the law library being part of the university libraries. It also happens when the law library is part of a larger consortium, as you mentioned. We in the law library have good data for the number of resource sharing transactions we make in a year. So the things that we page across campus, the things that we loan through the Summit Consortium, and the things that we loan through Interlibrary Loan, the World CAT for the world. So even though those run with different processes, because we're part of a major research library who has implemented the access sharing technologies as they've come along over the last 10 or 15 years, we have tremendous ability to share our resources. So when the ABA annual questionnaire used to include, like up until last year, the number of borrows and the number of lends.
Well, I remember that question. We
Yes.
usually invented the answer.
Well, we have very good data.
Yeah.
And we don't have to invent the answer.
Yeah.
But probably other law libraries do, because we always ended up second or third
Yeah.
in both
We
categories.
kept very careful statistics for a period of time, like a week,
Right.
during the
Right.
normal term. And then
Right.
we basically expanded on that. So when I say
Right.
we invented it, was a guesstimate.
Of course,
Yeah.
yes. And that's
it
what
wasn't a complete
sampling.
falsification.
Sure. And that's what people had to do, because as smaller libraries, it is not feasible for us economically always to have the latest and greatest library technology. So, as you know, like I said before, I think that there are pros and cons to organizing a law library as part of the university library system. But one of the benefits is the ability to take advantage of those current larger technologies that we're not priced out of because we're so small. So one day last year, one of our faculty, we went through the reaccreditation process last year, and bless his heart, we had a faculty member on the self-study team who actually read all of the library documents that I was submitting. And I think many times the faculty just assume that the library's doing a great job and they don't really need to read all of those documents.
They have other priorities for their time.
Right. But our professor came up to me and he said, you know, we're a poor law school. And I understand.
I hope he means in the financial sense.
He meant in the financial sense. He said, I understand why we're number 2 in borrowing, but I don't understand what we have that makes us number 2 in lending.
Uh-huh.
And I said, Mosen, we have the same thing as everybody else. We're just really good at getting it out there when somebody asks. So we end up at the top of the lending queues
Yeah.
quite a bit.
Well, that's great. I mean, when you need something, people owe you favors instead of you're always taking.
One thing that I think this library is really strong in is getting stuff and lending stuff. So I'm happy about that because I think that we all need to pay more attention to that.
Yeah.
So
I think it always is helpful when it's a two-way process.
you bet. Because then when you need those loose leaves from the basement from 1939 that we haven't had since 1940, somebody is willing to go down and get them for us.
That's right.
Yeah.
They owe you.
Yes.
At least they think they do.
Yes. Well, more and more, our local collections are what distinguish us.
So you've been here at the University of Oregon since 2002.
2004.
2004.
I keep mixing up the
It's
dates.
when you came back from Florida. got back to this part of the country where
Yes.
at least there isn't the heavy humidity in the summer,
Right.
although the weather down
10
there is
years.
pretty nice too.
Well, although, it's really too much when you're already perspiring as you get out of the shower. It's too much.
Yeah,
So.
I lived for 3 years in Houston. I remember the humidity there, and I imagine the Jacksonville area is
It's
much
very
different.
hot and humid. Yes. Yeah.
It's a nice
Beautiful.
part of the country over there, though.
It is.
I visited there a year ago, and I was doing some of these conversations
Right.
for the
Right.
collection, and
Right.
including I did one of them at Florida Coastal.
Well, one of the things I really liked about Florida Coastal was that that our students, so many of our students were already professionals in the banking or insurance fields, because those are two areas where Jacksonville has built up their city, their industry. And many of those people would have wanted to go to law school, but they needed to go at night because they needed to support their families and keep their full-time jobs. So a lot of the students that I taught were evening students. And some of the most motivated people with good life experience, which I think always adds to the depth of an attorney's skills, is when he or she can be empathetic with real people.
Yeah, we had a part-time program where I was on faculty, and I found
I love
part-time
that.
students had a dimension that you often didn't see in the
Right.
full-time division, as we
Right.
called the day program.
I would like to, if I could have two things at Oregon that we don't have right now, I'd love to have a part-time program in the law school, and I'd also like to have a library school at the university because, of course, the library school here closed many years ago.
Yeah.
But there's nothing like a library student to work at the circulation desk and bring all of the energy and inventiveness and technology skills that young people swim in.
And all the stuff they're learning now in library
Yeah.
school that, we take for granted, but,
Right.
we had to learn it on, coming up as it was developing.
Right, punch cards.
Oh, I remember those. And then the stuff, the holes that get all punched out, and then if somebody tipped it over, they're all over the house
Right.
floor.
Right. Well, those were the catalog cards, right?
Uh,
Oh, that was difficult.
yeah.
Yeah.
Well, talk about maybe a little more about something you've done here at the University of Oregon now. You've been here around 10 years or so.
Right. Well, it's been the right range of time to hit a lot of the aspects in librarianship that we think of as current. So when I came in 10 years ago, It was a beautiful building, a beautiful library. Everything, all of the books were on the shelves and they were all in order. And that's what I noticed when I came for my interview. I said, this is the tidiest library I've ever
It
seen.
looked pretty tidy when we walked through it earlier today.
It's a little messier now.
Well, it's being a lot of students using it, but
Right,
I did notice
right.
that most of the books look like they were where they should be.
But if it hadn't happened before, in the last 10 years, we've taken the traditional law library model, in many ways turned it around to meet the emerging needs of students that we have now. So we've moved from 2,000 and more print serial titles to less than 600. And we've gone from a percentage of perhaps 20% for electronic resources to now 60% electronic resources is what we're spending. So the budget model has changed. The collections have changed drastically. We spend much more time and expertise from the librarians building a monographic collection based on the subjects that we teach and our centers and programs, and far less time just checking in periodicals. So it's a much more interesting collection now, to me at least. We have a lot more primary materials in terms not of the law. Of course, we still have access to the law, but we also have a lot of access to original academic content, research content in the monographic collection.
So you really broadened the scope of the collection building. Yeah.
Yes, we have. We have so much more content today than we had 10 years ago, thanks to the much larger monographic collection and the much larger electronic collections, because we've gone all in on everything that we can provide electronically and reduced duplication between electronic and print. That's why we've canceled so many of our serials and continue to cancel publications that are duplicated online, such as the statutes and the reports. So we've done a lot of cancellations that I think some librarians would be nervous with. And then again, some librarians got rid of them before we did.
I mean, my generation, I've been retired about 12 years now, and
Yes.
it was beginning big time.
Yes.
We saw it in DC with the law firms first.
Yes,
I mean, they
exactly.
basically were worried about the cost of the footage needed
Exactly.
to house all this stuff.
Right.
So they moved very quickly.
Right,
And but
Right.
the academics have been brought into it as expectations, ABA
Right.
standards have changed to
Right.
reflect these realities and,
Right.
and empower us to do this sort of
yes,
thing. And I've heard it
Yes.
described by many of our colleagues in going around doing
Yes.
these conversations.
Yes.
I have little chit chats with everybody.
yeah,
And today's law students often will be sitting in front of a whole wall full of books.
yes,
But if whatever it is isn't on that screen in front of his nose or her nose, it doesn't exist for
Right.
that student.
right.
They expect it to be in digital
Yes.
form.
So we make every effort to give it to them in
Mhm.
digital form. And the books that are on the shelves are, for the most part, we're trying not to duplicate.
Mhm.
So if it is online, we are not going to buy it in print
Uh-huh.
as much as possible. And then there's, a small teaching collection. And we coordinate with the legal research and writing faculty on which volumes and which reporters, which print statutes they still need. Although we push them harder every year to move to teaching it in electronic only. Because from the information that we get from our alums, very few are reliant solely on print materials.
Now, one of the problems that my generation faced was bringing faculty along, some of the, especially the more
Yes.
senior ones, but not
Yes.
necessarily,
Yes.
who were, basically accustomed to finding
Right.
it on a normal
Right.
printed page of a book.
Right.
And we had to keep certain things in print
Yes.
because of that. Because you,
Yes.
as a librarian, you're serving the faculty as well as the students.
Yes.
And I remember we had a small faculty library, and we had a few books there, and I
Right.
cut them when we had some budget problems one year, and one of my faculty colleagues was very concerned.
Yes.
So we reinstated them, but.
Yes.
um,
Yes.
Have you found the faculties are sort of modernizing themselves in their expectations on where to go, what to look for in a library?
You know, that I think is dependent a lot on the library.
Uh-huh.
So, for instance, we have a very active liaison program, and each of our reference and instructional librarians and me and a couple of the technical services librarians are responsible for particular subject areas, and we liaise with the faculty who teach in those areas or do research in those areas. So as we have cut print, we've gotten permission and buy-in from the faculty by going to their offices and working with them on replacing, for instance, the routing of print periodicals with the current awareness service tied to that particular journal. So if a faculty member would subscribe to the high cost of litigation, then we would go, before we canceled that $600 a year periodical, we would go to the faculty member who was having it routed and make sure that they were set up and competent to and comfortable to use it online. And if we couldn't bring somebody along, then we would keep the print publication.
Yeah.
For the most part, that time is past. We have only perhaps 2 faculty left who are dependent on a particular print publication. And with the addition of younger faculty and the willingness and ability of our established faculty to change their formatting, because it's actually easier for them to get, and they can do it at home, and they have help when they want it. It really has not been a struggle.
That's interesting, because, and I'm not totally surprised. I mean, I'm thinking back, Lexis, Westlaw, which were sort of the beginning
Right.
legal databases,
Right,
came into the law schools around 1980,
right,
give or take a
right.
couple of years on either side.
Yeah.
That's farther back now than I realized.
It's a long
And I
time ago.
suppose even today's more senior faculty, many of them were students
Right?
while that was the norm, or had
Right.
become the norm.
And now we have Bloomberg,
Mhm.
which has PACER and the B&A analysis
Yeah.
available, and the more specialized resources for tax and business. And our faculty have had to adjust to an ever-expanding universe that has things that they need. And it's been interesting to watch. I think, a lot of the searching is not as precise as it used to be. And so a lot more people can do it. And it's what we were thinking about earlier on when I said, when the librarian was the gatekeeper and the expert. Well, we can't do that because there's too much information out there. And so even though my colleagues would say, it's a terrible search engine because we don't have the precision or the recall
Yeah.
that we know is possible. And it just gets worse and worse.
Yeah.
Actually, it gets more and more attuned to the people who actually need that information, so they can do it. They can do it themselves.
Well, I
Anybody
suppose the
could.
people writing the search engine software or whatever, technical stuff, they're learning to respond to everyday language.
Right.
The sorts of questions people would ask
Right.
themselves, they now ask the computer, and
Right.
it tells them the answer as
Right.
much as it can.
Yeah, and I'm not saying, please don't get me wrong, I am not saying that the quality of legal research is where it used to be. I don't think it is. But it's possible for people to do it. And with as many attorneys having to turn in as many motions as happens, there can't be a librarian for everyone.
No.
So we've got to make sure that it's doable by a professional with minimal skills and give them the best product we can.
Hence the need for the research and writing courses.
Right?
That you have in law school and now in the advanced ones as well.
Exactly. Yeah.
Very good.
Yeah.
Well, Mary Ann, we've talked about a lot today. There are a couple of things I often like to ask that we haven't talked about yet, and one of them is we've alluded to that you have a broader role here in the university in some ways. You want to talk a little bit about that? You're part of the faculty of
Right.
the law school, but you're
Right.
also part of the whatever it's technically
Right.
called, the librarians at
Right.
the university.
Right. I am a member, I have a dual appointment. I'm a member of I'm a full professor in the law faculty, and I'm an honorary professor in the library faculty.
That sounds like an important one to me. That honorary sounds pretty good.
Well, I'm a department head on the Council of Librarians who advise the dean of the libraries.
So you get involved in the governance end of the libraries and
Yes.
broadly on the
Yes.
campus then.
Yes, I mean, one of the disadvantages to being a library that's integrated, that serves the law school, and is integrated into the UO library system, the university library system, is that you're a member of two departments and you have the administrative and the faculty responsibilities of both. So I chair the curriculum committee in the university library faculty, and I've served as the presiding officer of the UO Libraries faculty. I'm on law school committees, and I'm a faculty member and administrator meeting with the other administrators and the other faculty in the law school. So I do a lot of administrative work. But on the other hand, for everybody else except for me, it works great because there's a lot more communication between the law librarians and the university librarians. We're able to take advantage of advances in librarianship that occur in an ARL research library. And that benefits our users tremendously. We have access to many more sources and technologies than we would have if we were not part of this ARL university library. And the libraries benefit from the law librarian's expertise. As subject specialists in a fairly complex field, they're able to lead initiatives in the university libraries that have to do with teaching and liaising with faculty. So it's a very sort of vibrant mix, I think, and that makes it a lot of fun and very interesting. And
Well, sounds like it more than keeps you busy.
it does.
And this job has lasted longer than 3 years, your
I
old
know,
norm, so
I
you
know.
must not be bored silly.
I'm not an entry-level librarian anymore.
Well, that's true.
Well, one of the things that's happened is that I've learned more and more about administration, and so Penny has let me teach the administration course.
That was another thing I wanted to delve into, because
Yes.
you come on up to Seattle every summer now, it seems. You've
Well,
been there at least twice that I know of.
This I think is going to be my 5th summer.
Is it?
To
Yeah.
do it? Yes. Yes.
'Cause one reason I know this is we were trying to get together to do this
Right.
conversation probably
Yes.
a couple of years ago
Yes.
when you were coming
Yeah.
up. But
Yes.
You were sort of busy.
Well, it's prep work and
Yes.
I do it on my vacation. So from here.
Yeah. Well, you're up there for, what is it, 3 or 4 weeks? And
Yeah.
then you go to the annual meeting of the AALL.
I have, but I have a conflict this year.
Philadelphia is not on your list
It's
this
not in the picture, but
Oh.
a family wedding is.
year. Well, given that, I
Yes.
suppose everyone will understand.
Yes. Yes, but the students have been great. I mean, I have really enjoyed that assignment. That's just been
Well, she's had quite a few over the last few years, too. I remember
Yes.
about 2 years ago, there were at least a dozen or more.
14.
14, yeah.
I think so.
Yeah, I mean, this is a program that usually
Yes.
had 1, 2, 3 back in the
Yes.
old days.
And oh my gosh, they are so bright and
Uh-huh.
inventive. I have benefited tremendously by stealing their ideas and putting them into practice in my library. It's been great.
Yeah, well, in the old days, we had to go off be on inspection teams of other colleagues to steal lots of good ideas. Now you have another source, second source.
Yes, well, you take your ideas wherever you can get them, right?
Sounds well worth it. Spoken like a true director.
It's all a team effort, Pat.
That's right.
Yeah.
Well, there is one other thing we haven't talked about
Yeah.
that I like to ask. And that is, we've talked a little bit about you and your life and so on, but do you have any particular hobbies or passions or special interests that maybe, if you have any time at all outside of work, that you can enjoy?
I have a 15-year-old. I have a freshman in high school who's the apple of my eye.
Ah.
And he and his dad and I like to travel. And Charlie might be the youngest person in America who knows dozens of brew pubs inside and out because Stuart and I are huge beer fans.
Oh.
And so wherever we go, we're looking for their brew pub.
Yeah, you have to go
Yes.
to the right place. They'll let him in the door.
Yes, they let him in the door. He's not interested in the beer, but he's well traveled through the pubs.
Well, he's not too many years away from when he can be interested in the beer if he wants.
I don't want to think about
Get
that.
him introduced to good beer, though.
Right, right. And of course, I read a lot.
Yeah.
I'm a librarian.
Real books, huh?
Both.
Yeah.
I love.
Well, I did notice you have a collection here in the library for the students and
Yes.
others of current
Yes.
fiction, I guess is probably the word for it.
Yes, we have 600 books in our popular reading collection, and it has bestsellers, New York Times bestsellers, and most highly circulated volumes in the libraries of the Pacific Northwest. So we call from lots of sources, and it's a wildly popular collection.
I imagine it is very popular.
Yes.
Yeah.
And
And then you have the video,
Yes.
the DVDs.
yes, we have all of the
certain movies.
and television series.
Ah.
We've got Game of Thrones and Mad Men and just all kinds of popular TV series. And really and truly, it's part of our effort to make the law library a welcoming place for the law students. They work very hard and they work long hours. So if I can save them a trip to the video store or the public library downtown by providing recreational reading and viewing, I'm happy to do that. I think it's a good investment.
I remember one of my longtime, really best friends in our profession, who's no longer with us, unfortunately, Marty Wolf, had that exact same sentiment in his library at St. Thomas in South Florida.
Yes.
He had a collection
Yes.
of videos, and there were videotapes in those days.
Right, they're DVDs.
And some books now that are a little more up to
And
date.
hopefully we can do streaming video. But, you know, the bottom line is it's a library. We're not buying subscriptions for individuals. So you've got to let me share it across the institution.
Yeah.
And then if it's good, we'll buy it.
Good. Well, why not?
Yes.
No, that sounds great. Now, is there anything we haven't talked about? Because we're sort of nearing the end of today's conversation, Mary Ann. Is there anything we haven't discussed that you would like to mention before we wrap it up?
I think in some ways I am very, very focused on our own law faculty and law students and the university at large. And I have a lot of admiration for those librarians who have shared their expertise at the national level. And so if anything, I would just want to say thank you to all of those librarians who got the profession to the level of expertise and professionalism that we have today. And so You're one of them,
Oh,
and
thank you.
you know all of the other ones. We are standing on your shoulders.
Mhm.
Thank you.
Well, I'm glad to hear that somebody thinks I did the right thing. Hopefully you're not the only one.
I bet I'm not.
Yeah. Well, maybe on that, I better quit while we're ahead, while I'm ahead.
Yeah.
And Mary Ann Hyatt, I want to thank you for being part of today's conversation. As I alluded to earlier, we've been trying to schedule this for a while, and finally we're able to do it.
Yeah.
And in thanking you, I'm thanking you not only on my behalf, but also on behalf of Michelle Wu, Frank Hodak, and of course Dick Spinelli, our colleagues with whom
Right.
I am working to develop this oral history of our profession.
Talk about giants.
During our time.
Thank you for having
Thank
me.
you.